The Anarchy, a civil war in England and Normandy between 1135 and 1153, sparked by a succession crisis following the death of King Henry I. The only legitimate son of Henry had died in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leading him to name his daughter, Empress Matilda, as the heir. However, upon Henry's death, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, quickly seized the throne, contested by Matilda, of course, which led to a prolonged and chaotic period of conflict across the kingdom. Thus the country was divided, as nobles aligned themselves either with Stephen or Matilda, leading to widespread disorder, with many areas experiencing complete breakdowns in law and order. The conflict saw numerous battles, sieges, and shifts in power, with neither side able to hold on to anything for too long. Eventually, the anarchy ended with the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153. Stephen recognized Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, later Henry II, as his heir, leading to the restoration of peace and the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, great to meet you. If you are coming back, so happy to see you again. As always, if you want to support the channel, you're already doing it. Just enjoy the content. But for those who want to go above and beyond, the like and subscribe is only one click away, and those who want to go further than that may refer to the video description. But now, without further ado, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can learn all about the anarchy, as it is so called. During the 11th and 12th centuries, northwest France was ruled by various dukes and counts, who often fought over valuable territories. Duke William II of Normandy, who would go on to conquer the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England in 1066, later extended his territories into South Wales and northern England. After the death of William, the governance and distribution of these lands led to conflicts among his children. William's son, Henry I, ascended to power following the death of his elder brother, William Rufus, and he took over the Duchy of Normandy from his oldest brother, Robert Curthose, after defeating him at the Battle of Tinchebray. Henry planned for his territories to be passed on to his only legitimate son, William Adelin. However, in 1120, the sudden sinking of the White Ship in the English Channel, which resulted in the death of about 300 passengers, including William Adelin, drastically altered the political scene. This event cast uncertainty on the line of succession to the English throne. At that time, the rules for succession varied across Western Europe. While male primogeniture was gaining acceptance in parts of France, where the eldest son inherits pretty much everything. But other regions, including Normandy and England, followed a practice of dividing lands among sons, with the eldest receiving the primary, or at least the most valuable, portion. Thus, with the death of William Adelin, Henry I was left with only one other legitimate offspring, his daughter, Matilda. During a time when the norms around female inheritance were simply not firmly established yet, there was no real rules behind it. Well, Henry, he married Adeliza of Louvain after Adeline's death, but the likelihood of having another legitimate male heir seemed quite slim, prompting him to consider Matilda as his successor. Matilda, previously married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, had gained the title of Empress. After Henry V's death in 1125, she remarried Godfrey V of Anjou in 1128, an alliance that was quite unpopular among the Anglo-Norman nobility, mainly due to Godfrey's status as an Angevin, who were the traditional adversaries of the Normans. Henry's domestic policies, particularly his heavy taxation to fund wars, caused growing discontent. Despite this, his formidable reputation helped maintain peace. Henry worked to secure support for Matilda's succession in England and Normandy, insisting on oaths of allegiance to her from his court in 1127, and again in 1128 and 1131. Stephen of Blois, among others, swore allegiance to Matilda in 1127. However, as Henry's life drew closer to its end, tensions escalated between him, Matilda, and Geoffrey. The couple felt that they lacked robust support in England and proposed that Henry transfer control of Norman royal castles to Matilda during his lifetime to strengthen her position. Henry was not keen on this idea, and he rejected the proposal, fearing that Geoffrey might seize premature control over Normandy. Amidst these tensions and a new rebellion in southern Normandy, which Geoffrey and Matilda supported militarily, Henry fell ill and unexpectedly died near Lyon-la-Forêt in 1135. Following the death of Henry I, the English crown was unexpectedly claimed by Stephen of Blois, leading to a period of civil war instead of passing to Henry's designated heir, Matilda. Now, Stephen was the son of Stephen Henry, the Count of Blois, and Adela of Normandy, making him William the Conqueror's grandson. As first cousins, Stephen and Matilda shared royal blood. Stephen grew up as a courtier under Henry, benefiting from his allegiance by receiving lands and marrying Matilda of Boulogne in 1125, who brought with her substantial estates in England and the vital continental port of Boulogne. By the time of Henry I's death in 1135, Stephen had established himself firmly within the Anglo-Norman elite, while his younger brother, Henry of Blois, the Bishop of Winchester, had become a significant ecclesiastical and political figure, second in wealth only to the king himself, and an advocate for the church's rights against royal encroachment. As Henry I's demise became known, many potential successors, including Geoffrey and Matilda, who were in Anjou supporting local rebels, were poorly positioned to stake their claims. Thus the conflict detained many of Matilda's supporters in Normandy under obligation to attend the late king's funeral, preventing their immediate return to England. And taking advantage of this situation, Geoffrey and Matilda seized several strategic castles in southern Normandy, but their advance stalled there. Stephen, meanwhile, was strategically located in Boulogne. Upon hearing of the king's death, he quickly moved to England with his military retinue. Despite initial resistance at ports controlled by Matilda's ally Robert of Gloucester, Stephen managed to reach his estates near London by early December. Within a week, he had effectively begun to consolidate power, setting the stage for his eventual ascension to the English throne. The populace of London, who traditionally held the prerogative to elect the English monarch, swiftly declared Stephen the new king, motivated by expectations of new rights and privileges under his rule. The Church's endorsement was also secured by Henry of Blois, who facilitated Stephen's access to the royal treasury at Winchester, on the advice of Roger, the Bishop of Salisbury and the Lord Chancellor. Thus, on December 15th, a pivotal agreement was struck. Stephen would bestow extensive liberties to the Church in exchange for the backing of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the papal legate for his ascension to the throne. The legitimacy of Stephen's claim was contentious, due to a previous oath that he had sworn to support Empress Matilda. However, Henry of Blois contended that the late King Henry had erred in mandating such an oath, arguing that the king had primarily aimed to ensure the realm's stability. Under the present circumstances of potential chaos, Stephen's disregard for the oath was presented as justifiable. Henry also persuaded Hugh Bigod, the royal steward, to testify that King Henry had altered his succession plans on his deathbed in favor of Stephen. This assertion cleared the way for Stephen's coronation at Westminster Abbey on December 26th. Concurrently, the Norman aristocracy convened at Leneubourg, considering endorsing Theobald, Stephen's elder brother and the Count of Blois, as king, mainly based on his senior lineage from William the Conqueror and his preferable status over Matilda. Thus, on December 21st, while discussions were underway in Lisieux with Robert of Gloucester and others about Theobald's claim, news of Stephen's imminent coronation disrupted their plans. Despite initial agreement to Theobald's kingship, support waned as the barons balked at the prospect of splitting England and Normandy by opposing Stephen. Ultimately, Theobald accepted a financial settlement from Stephen and remained in Blois, supporting his brother's ascension and thus consolidating Stephen's position as a king. Shortly after his coronation, Stephen had to address the tensions in northern England, sparked by the invasion of David I of Scotland. Now David, who was the brother of Henry I's first queen and Matilda's maternal uncle, seized territories, including Carlisle and Newcastle, upon the hearing of Henry's death. These areas were contentious, with Scottish claims on Cumberland and David's marital ties to Northumbria. Stephen promptly led an army north to Durham, where he negotiated with David. This agreement allowed David to retain Carlisle, while returning most of his other conquests, and in exchange, Stephen confirmed the holdings of David's son, Prince Henry, including the earldom of Huntingdon. In 1136, Stephen convened his first royal court during Easter at Westminster, attracting a broad assembly of nobility and high-ranking church officials. At this gathering, Stephen issued a royal charter reaffirming the commitments made to the church and pledged to undo Henry I's forest policies and addressed any legal system abuses. He positioned himself as a continuation of Henry I's governance, reconfirming the existing earldoms to their holders. The court was marked by extravagance in expenditure on the event, attire, and gifts. Stephen distributed land grants and favors, enhancing numerous church establishments with land and privileges. To solidify his position, Stephen needed papal endorsement. Henry of Blois facilitated the gathering of this support, securing testimonials from Stephen's brother, Theobald, and the French king, Louis VI, who found Stephen's kingship strategically advantageous against the Angevin influence. Pope Innocent II officially recognized Stephen's kingship later that year through a letter, which was extensively circulated in England to affirm Stephen's legitimacy. Stephen faced significant challenges across his realm shortly after this coronation. In January of 1136, the Welsh secured a victory at the Battle of Shofar, followed by a successful ambush on Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare in April, igniting a rebellion across all of South Wales. Owain Gwynedd and Gruffydd ap Rhys seized substantial territories, including Carmarthen Castle. Despite attempts to quell the unrest by dispatching Robert's brother Baldwin and marcher Lord Robert Fitzharold of Eyas, the rebellions persisted, and by the end of 1137, Stephen had effectively ceased his military efforts in Wales, turning his attention to other pressing and perhaps more realistically winnable matters. Concurrently, Stephen managed revolts in the southwest led by Baldwin de Redvers and Robert of Bampton. Baldwin was captured, but he was released, subsequently traveling to Normandy to criticize Stephen. The same year, Geoffrey of Anjou began aggressive actions against Normandy, exploiting Stephen's preoccupation with England. Despite a temporary truce, Geoffrey resumed his attacks, focusing on raiding rather than conquering. Stephen's inability to address the Norman conflicts directly led to the appointment of Waleran de Beaumont and Theobald to defend the duchy. Stephen returned to Normandy in 1137 to solidify an informal alliance with Louis VI and Theobald, aimed at curbing Angevin influence. This agreement included Louis recognizing Stephen's son, Eustace, as Duke of Normandy, contingent on Eustace's homage to Louis. Efforts to reclaim the Argentan province from Geoffrey faltered, mainly due to internal conflicts among Stephen's forces, culminating in a battle between the Flemish mercenaries and Norman barons, resulting in the desertion of the Norman contingent. This forced Stephen to abandon his campaigns and negotiate another truce with Geoffrey, which included a payment to Geoffrey for peace along the borders. Now on to Stephen's early reign, which was marked by a mix of stabilization and strife, going back and forth between the two, with quite a bit of chaotic to and fro. While he managed to maintain a semblance of peace with Scotland, contained Geoffrey's actions in Normandy, and maintained cordial relations with Louis VI and the Church, there were many significant issues that loomed. Control over the north of England had shifted to David and Prince Henry. Wales had been effectively abandoned with a shrug of the shoulders, and the ongoing conflicts between Normandy destabilized the region. Basically, things were not easy. Furthermore, Stephen faced discontent among the barons over unfulfilled promises of land and titles. The financial strain was also mounting, with the costs of maintaining a more extravagant court and mercenary forces rapidly depleting the treasury that was amassed by Henry. In 1138, the stability of Stephen's reign faced major threats from multiple quarters, initiating a descent into civil war in England. The year saw Robert of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of Henry I and half-brother to Empress Matilda, renounce his allegiance to Stephen and declare his wholehearted support for Matilda. It was a move that sparked significant rebellions in Kent and the southwest of England, although Robert stayed in Normandy. Despite Matilda's relative inactivity in pressing her claim to the throne since 1135, Robert's declaration effectively marked the beginning of the war in her favor. Meanwhile, Geoffrey of Anjou seized the opportunity to re-invade Normandy, and David of Scotland launched another invasion into northern England. Asserting his support for his niece Empress Matilda, David pushed into Yorkshire, further complicating the political landscape for Stephen. But Stephen's response was swift and strategically focused on England rather than Normandy. Thus, he deployed his wife, Queen Matilda, to Kent with substantial resources to recapture the crucial port of Dover from rebel control. And of course, don't get confused, Stephen's wife was also named Matilda, so we will refer to her as Queen Matilda, and Empress Matilda being the other side of things. Now additionally, he sent a handful of his household knights north to counter the Scots, culminating in the defeat of David's forces at the Battle of the Standard in August, led by Archbishop Thurston of York. But despite this victory, David maintained control over much of northern England. It was then when Stephen turned his attention west, aiming to reassert control over Gloucestershire. His campaign began in the Welsh Marches, capturing Hereford and Shrewsbury before moving south to Bath. Although Bristol remained impervious to his assaults, resulting in a campaign of raiding the surrounding areas instead, Stephen managed to exert significant military pressure. The expectation of Robert's intervention with reinforcements for the rebels unfortunately did not materialize, as he stayed in Normandy, which persuaded Empress Matilda to consider an invasion of England. Towards the end of the year, Dover capitulated to Queen Matilda's forces. Stephen's military campaigns in England were notably successful, described by historians as a military achievement of the first rank. Capitalizing on his military upper hand, Stephen also sought to stabilize the northern border by negotiating the Treaty of Durham with Scotland. Under this treaty, Northumbria and Cumbria were effectively granted to David and his son Henry in exchange for their allegiance and a promise of peace along the border. This agreement, however, did not sit well with the Earl of Chester, Ranulph, who felt that his traditional rights to Carlisle and Cumberland were being undermined. By 1139, preparations for an invasion of England by Robert of Gloucester and Matilda were well underway. Geoffrey and Matilda had consolidated their control over much of Normandy and were mobilizing forces for a cross-channel attack. Early in the year, Matilda had appealed to the papacy, asserting her legal claim to the English throne, although the Pope maintained his previous support for Stephen. This appeal highlighted the contentions surrounding Stephen's claim. In response to the impending threat, Stephen fortified his position by creating numerous new earldoms. Prior to his reign, the existing earldoms established under Henry I were, for the most part, ceremonial. Stephen filled these new earldoms with loyal and competent military leaders, granting them lands and significant powers, particularly in the kingdom's more vulnerable regions. His strategy aimed to secure the loyalty of key supporters and strengthen the kingdom's defences. Influenced heavily by his chief adviser, Waleran de Beaumont, Stephen granted the new earldoms, including Worcester, Leicester, Hertford, Warwick, and Pembroke, to the Beaumont family and their allies. These earldoms formed a strategic buffer zone across critical areas of the kingdom from 1138 onwards. Simultaneously, Stephen moved to neutralize a potential threat from certain bishops, whom he suspected might have sensibilities that would make them defect to Matilda's side. The royal administration under the previous king, Henry I, had been dominated by Roger, the Bishop of Salisbury, and his family, who had been amassing military strength and building quite a few new castles. Viewing this as a potential threat, and exacerbated by a personal enmity from Waleran, Stephen took decisive action. In June 1139, during a court session in Oxford, a confrontation engineered by Stephen resulted in a skirmish involving Alan of Brittany and Roger's men. Stephen capitalized on this incident by demanding the surrender of all castles held by the bishops, except for Nigel, whom had barricaded himself in Devizes Castle, and only surrendered after Stephen threatened to execute Roger le Poer. All complied. Now, this maneuver effectively eliminated any military threat from these bishops, although it no doubt strained Stephen's relations with the broader ecclesiastical hierarchy, including his brother Henry, who was reportedly not very impressed. Well, with all the preparations complete, the stage was set for the ensuing conflict, marking the full escalation into a civil war. During this civil war between Stephen and Matilda, Anglo-Norman warfare primarily involved attritional military campaigns focused on raiding enemy territories and capturing castles to gain control over regions. These campaigns aimed for a slow and strategic string of victories rather than quick conquests. Pitched battles were therefore quite rare, as they were considered high risk. I mean, why arrange up in a shield wall and go out and fight like gentlemen when you can just starve them out over time? Thus, the commanders typically preferred safer, more calculated maneuvers, a cautious approach to warfare. But you can't fight a war without money. We all know that. The financing of the war efforts was heavily reliant on cold, hard cash, a trend that had become increasingly pronounced in the early 12th century. The cost of maintaining and conducting military operations had thus risen significantly, making access to substantial funds a critical factor in achieving military success. Both Stephen and Matilda's military operations were centered around their respective households, particularly the Familia Regis, a core group of knights that acted as a mobile headquarters during campaigns. The composition of the armies had not drastically changed from the previous century. It consisted mainly of armored mounted knights, supported by infantry troops. The typical armament included long mail hauberks, helmets, greaves, and arm protection. Swords and lances were commonly used by cavalry, and the presence of crossbowmen had notably increased. Longbows, well, they were sometimes employed alongside the traditional short bow. The forces employed during these campaigns were thus a mix of feudal levies and mercenaries. Feudal levies were local nobles' troops, called up for short periods and specific campaigns, whereas mercenaries, though costly, offered greater flexibility and skill, and could be retained for extended periods as needed. The Normans first developed their distinctive style of castles during the 10th and 11th centuries, utilizing these fortifications extensively when they took control of England in 1066. Initially, most castles were earthwork and timber structures, such as the moat and bailey or ringwork designs. These were relatively simple to construct with local labor and resources, making them resilient and easy to defend. The Anglo-Norman elite strategically placed these castles along key geographic points, like rivers and valleys, to exert control over populations, trade routes, and broadly entire regions. By the time of the Civil War, there was a gradual shift to a more robust, stone-built style. These new structures required more skilled labor and took several seasons to build, contrasting with the quicker timber constructions. While these stone keeps later showed some structural vulnerabilities, the siege technologies of the 1140s, such as ballistae and mangonels, were considerably less powerful than the trebuchet designs of later times, allowing these castles to maintain a defensive advantage. Consequently, warfare tactics often favored prolonged sieges, or even mining operations to undermine castle walls rather than direct assaults. Of course, if you dig out the foundation of the castle, a rather dangerous job, certainly helps it to crumble right beneath the enemy. Who knows? Someone could be digging a hole under your house right now, and you wouldn't even know it. Sorry to those who are about to sleep. Well, back to the topic. During the war, both sides extensively built their own new castles to secure strategic territories. In the southwest, Matilda's supporters constructed a series of moat and bailey castles, such as those at Winchcombe, Upper Slaughter, and Bampton to fortify their holdings. Stephen, on the other hand, aiming to protect his interests around Cambridge, established a new chain of castles along the fen edge at locations like Burwell, Lydgate, Caxton, Rampton, and Swavesey, spaced roughly 6 to 9 miles apart. Many of these were built without royal permission, and were thus considered adulterine or unauthorized, highlighting the anarchic nature and panicked building of the period. Historical records suggest a high number of such castles were constructed, though exact figures tend to vary. Now, counter castles or siege castles also became prominent during the conflict. These were temporary fortifications erected during sieges to house troops or siege engines, positioned just outside the effective range of archery from the main target. These structures facilitated prolonged sieges and played a crucial role in the strategic warfare of the period. Although intended for temporary use and often dismantled post-conflict, some remnants, like the earthworks near Corfe Castle in Dorset, known as the Rings, still survive. Now moving on, in August 1139. The anticipated Angevin invasion commenced. Baldwin de Redvers attempted an initial landing at Warham to secure a port for Empress Matilda's forces, but was repelled by Stephen's troops. Retreating to the southwest, by the end of September, Matilda and Robert of Gloucester arrived in England at Arundel with 140 knights, thanks to an invitation from the Queen Dowager Adeliza. While Matilda stayed at Arundel Castle, Robert advanced northwards to rally support in Wallingford and Bristol, joining forces with Miles of Gloucester, who had recently renounced his loyalty to Stephen. Stephen swiftly countered by besieging Arundel, effectively trapping Empress Matilda. However, a truce brokered by his brother, Henry of Blois, unexpectedly led Stephen to lift the siege, allowing Matilda and her knights safe passage to the southwest to reunite with Robert of Gloucester. The motives behind Stephen's decision to release Matilda remain a little speculative. Chronicles of the time suggest that Henry persuaded Stephen that focusing on Robert as the primary threat was strategically advantageous. Moreover, the impregnability of Arundel Castle and the operational risk of engaging his forces there while Robert was free in the west might have influenced Stephen's decision. Some even suggest that Stephen's act was driven purely by chivalry, given his known generous nature and the norms of not targeting women in warfare. It's just bad manners, isn't it? Well, following these events, Matilda established a strong base of operations, spanning from Gloucester and Bristol across to Devon and Cornwall, and from the Welsh marches to Oxford and Wallingford, posing a direct threat to London itself. Stephen attempted to regain control by first targeting Wallingford Castle, a strategic point along the Thames, but found it to be too well defended by Brienne Fitzcount. Leaving a force to continue the blockade, he moved westward, capturing South Kearney and Malmesbury, but was unable to take Trowbridge in Wiltshire. Concurrently, Miles of Gloucester launched attacks on Stephen's rear positions at Wallingford, threatening to advance towards London. Faced with these challenges, Stephen was compelled to abandon his campaign in the west and return east to stabilize the situation and secure his capital. By early 1140, Bishop Nigel of Ely, having had his castle seized by Stephen the previous year, initiated a rebellion. He aimed to control East Anglia and made the Isle of Ely, protected by surrounding Fenland, his stronghold. Stephen swiftly countered, leading an army into the fens and crafting a makeshift causeway from boats to launch a surprise attack on the island. Although Nigel managed to flee Gloucester, his forces were overcome, and Stephen regained control of the region. Meanwhile, forces loyal to Robert of Gloucester reclaimed the lost territories of Stephen in the earlier 1139 campaigns. Efforts to broker peace unfolded at a conference in Bath, hosted by Henry of Blois. The discussions, intended to negotiate a truce, featured Robert representing the Empress Matilda, with Queen Matilda, remember, Stephen's wife, and Archbishop Theobald advocating for Stephen. The conference disintegrated due to Henry and the clergy's demands to dictate the terms of the peace, a condition which Stephen could of course not accept. Rainulf of Chester still aggrieved by Stephen's allocation of northern England to Prince Henry, plotted to ambush the prince during his return from Stephen's court to Scotland post-Christmas. Forewarned, Stephen personally escorted Henry north, inadvertently exacerbating Rainulf's frustrations. Seizing an opportunity under the pretense of a social visit, Rainulf captured Lincoln Castle in a sudden assault. Stephen, seeking to neutralize Rainulf without escalating hostilities, negotiated a truce that allowed Rainulf to retain the castle. However, upon learning that Rainulf and his family were lightly guarded at the castle, Stephen reneged on the truce and led his forces back to Lincoln for a surprise attack. Unfortunately for Stephen, Ranulph managed to escape, subsequently pledging allegiance to Empress Matilda, compelling Stephen to besiege Lincoln Castle once again. In early 1141, while Stephen besieged Lincoln Castle, Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester approached with a superior force. Stephen decided to engage in battle rather than retreat. Commanding the center of his army, with flanking forces led by Alan of Brittany and William of Aumale, Stephen dismounted his knights to form a solid infantry block and joined them himself on foot. Despite an initial success against the Angevin forces, the battle quickly turned. Robert and Rainulf's cavalry encircled Stephen's position, leading to his eventual capture after a fierce fight, during which he continued to resist, even after he had broken his sword, switching to a battle axe, until eventually overwhelmed and captured. Robert then transported Stephen to Gloucester for a brief meeting with Empress Matilda, before moving him to Bristol Castle, where he was initially held under relatively comfortable conditions, which later was changed to smacking some chains on him. Perhaps he wasn't the most gracious house guest. That's what you get for being rude. Matilda then began efforts to be crowned queen, requiring ecclesiastical support, which involved negotiations with Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois. Henry, acting as the papal legate, convened a council at Winchester to discuss the stance of the Church, offering support to Matilda in exchange for control over church matters in England. Despite Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury's hesitations, and after consultations with Stephen, who conceded to release his subjects from their oaths of fealty given the circumstances, the clergy named Matilda Lady of England and Normandy. However, her planned coronation at London faced significant opposition. Tensions in London escalated, and a revolt forced her and her followers to flee the city just days before her scheduled coronation. Better luck next time. Meanwhile, Geoffrey of Anjou capitalized on the turmoil by invading Normandy, capturing all territories south of the River Seine and east of the Rhine. With Stephen's power waning in England and Normandy, many Anglo-Norman barons began shifting their allegiance to Geoffrey and Matilda, fearing the loss of their lands. Among the defectors was Waleron, who joined the Angevin side to secure his own holdings. During Stephen's captivity in 1141, his wife, Queen Matilda, became a pivotal figure in maintaining support for his cause. She rallied Stephen's key supporters around her in the southeast, and advanced into London after the population there rejected the Empress Matilda. Among those loyal to Queen Matilda were William of Ypres, who stayed with her in London, William Martel, managing operations from Dorset, and Faramus of Boulogne, overseeing the royal household. Queen Matilda garnered significant sympathy and backing from Stephen's followers during this period. All seemed to be going quite well for her. However, the Bishop of Winchester, Henry, Stephen's brother, initially allied with the Empress Matilda, but their alliance soon deteriorated over disputes about political and ecclesiastical influence. Thus, Henry met with Queen Matilda in Guildford and shifted his support to her, which of course strengthened Stephen's position. The Empress Matilda's military efforts faltered during the rout of Winchester in July 1141, where she and Robert of Gloucester besieged Bishop Henry. The situation reversed when Queen Matilda and William of Ypres surrounded the Angevin forces, forcing the Empress to flee Winchester with a few close associates, although her army was ultimately defeated and Robert of Gloucester captured. Despite her escape to Devizes, the event significantly weakened her position. Negotiations for peace soon followed, but no compromise was reached, leading to an exchange of prisoners, Stephen for Robert of Gloucester. Not a bad deal. This occurred in November of 1141. A church council convened by Bishop Henry then reaffirmed Stephen's legitimacy, leading to a re-coronation of Stephen and Queen Matilda in Christmas of 1141. Not a bad present. But Stephen's health suffered in early 1142, which sparked rumors of his death. But despite the rumors, he did manage to recover and regain his strength, persuading Ranulf of Chester to rejoin his side. He then led attacks against the Angevin-held castles throughout the summer. Meanwhile, Robert of Gloucester went to Normandy to aid Geoffrey Plantagenet, but returned to England later that year. As 1142 drew to a close, the Empress Matilda found herself besieged by Stephen in Oxford Castle. She managed a dramatic escape across the frozen river Isis just before Christmas, evading capture and rejoining her forces at Wallingford, thus prolonging the civil war. The conflict between Stephen and the Angevins dragged on and on and on, with no clear end in sight throughout the mid-1140s, marked by Geoffrey of Anjou solidifying his own position in Normandy, culminating in his recognition as the Duke of Normandy after the capture of Rouen in 1144. The year 1143 began quite perilously for Stephen, when he found himself besieged by Robert of Gloucester at Wilton Castle, a critical gathering point for royal forces at Herefordshire. Attempting to escape, Stephen engaged in the Battle of Wilton, where he nearly got captured again. Thanks to the valiant efforts of William Martel, Stephen's steward who orchestrated a staunch rearguard action, Stephen did manage to escape, later exchanging Sherborne Castle to secure William's release from captivity. Later that year, Stephen faced a new insurrection from Geoffrey de Mandeville, the Earl of Essex, who rebelled against Stephen's authority in East Anglia. The king had harbored disdain for Geoffrey for years, and seized him under the pretense at court, threatening execution unless Geoffrey surrendered key fortresses, including the Tower of London. That's right, the best one. Once released, Geoffrey retreated to the Isle of Ely, launching a military campaign aimed at London. Stephen, preoccupied with other rebellions, could only erect a defensive line of castles from Ely to London, notably including Burwell Castle, to impede Geoffrey's advance. Meanwhile, Ranulph of Chester resumed his revolt in 1144, dividing Stephen's holdings in Lancaster between himself and Prince Henry. Simultaneously, Robert of Gloucester conducted raids around royalist territories, while maintaining the stronghold of Wallingford Castle near London. Concurrently, Geoffrey of Anjou secured southern Normandy, and by January 1144 took control of Rouen, subsequently gaining recognition from Louis VII as Duke of Normandy. By 1145, the war's landscape began to shift slightly in Stephen's favor. The death of Miles of Gloucester, a capable Angevin commander, during the previous Christmas lessened pressure in the west. Geoffrey de Mandeville continued his revolt until his death in September 1144 during an assault on Burwell. In 1145, Stephen managed to recapture Farringdon Castle in Oxfordshire. In the north, Stephen briefly reconciled with Ranulph of Chester in 1146, only to repeat his earlier strategy of arrest and coercion for castle handovers, which led to Ranulph's subsequent rebellion. Throughout these years, Stephen's tactics of ensnaring barons under the guise of diplomacy, only to arrest them, significantly tarnished his reputation. No one really wanted to go and see him upon receiving the invite. They knew what was coming. Mistrust, indeed. His standing was certainly diminished among the nobility. But of course it was his own fault. While the stalemate persisted, neither side was able to secure a decisive advantage. And by the late 1140s, the character of the conflict in England began to change, leading some historians to suggest that the Civil War was all but over, with only sporadic outbreaks of fighting occurring, but nothing large-scale. The period saw several key developments that contributed to a decrease in hostilities. Robert of Gloucester, a pivotal military leader for Empress Matilda, died in 1147, reducing the intensity of the conflict. The following year, Matilda moved back to Normandy after resolving a dispute with the church over Devizes Castle, further calming the situation. Around the same time, the Second Crusade was announced, drawing many Angevin supporters, including Wallerand of Beaumont, away from the region for an extended period. During this time, many nobles began making individual peace agreements to secure their territories and gains from the war. These treaties often included clauses that limited military actions and the construction of new castles, reflecting a broader desire to stabilize the region and reduce conflict as much as possible. A network of these treaties emerged by the 1150s, significantly reducing local skirmishes. Now as for Matilda, she chose to remain in Normandy, working to stabilize the duchy and support her son Henry Fitz-Empress's claim to the English throne. Henry? Well, he returned to England in 1149, aiming to build a northern alliance with Ranulph of Chester, which involved military plans against York. However, when Stephen rapidly responded by marching to York, the plan disintegrated, and Henry simply returned to Normandy, where he was declared duke by his father. Henry's stature, of course, continued to grow, especially after his strategic marriage in 1152 to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wealthy and influential Duchess of Aquitaine, and former wife of Louis VII of France. Stephen, meanwhile, focused increasingly on succession issues concerning his own family as the conflict wound down. He had granted the county of Boulogne to his eldest son, Eustace, in 1147, but was uncertain whether Eustace would inherit England. Stephen, of course, had his preference, and that was for Eustace to be crowned during his own lifetime, aligning with French customs, but not with English tradition. Efforts to secure a coronation for Eustace met with resistance from Archbishop Theobald, reflecting broader tensions within the church. These efforts culminated in a dramatic confrontation in 1152, where Stephen and Eustace detained Theobald and other bishops to force the coronation issue. Theobald's subsequent escape to Flanders marked a low point in Stephen's relations with the church, highlighting the ongoing governance challenges Stephen faced as he struggled to secure his family's future in the English monarchy. In 1153, Henry Fitz-Empress, supported by Ranulph of Chester and Hugh Bigod, returned to England, and with a small army, advancing his influence in the north and the east of the country. Stephen's castle at Malmesbury was soon under siege by the forces of Henry. He attempted to engage Henry's smaller army in a decisive battle along the river Avon, but he was unsuccessful, and with winter approaching, agreed to a temporary truce, retreating to London. This left Henry free to consolidate support in the Midlands, where Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, declared his allegiance to the Angevin cause. By 1153, Henry and his allies controlled significant portions of England, including the southwest, Midlands, and much of the north. As Easter approached, a delegation of senior English clergy met with Henry at Stockbridge. The discussions likely focused on a negotiated peace, with the clergy expressing support for Stephen, but overall simply just desiring an end to the conflict. Henry thus reassured them that he would respect the autonomy of the English cathedrals and not expect bishops to attend his court. The siege of Wallingford Castle, a key Angevin stronghold, became a critical focus for Stephen. Henry intervened, leading his forces to besiege Stephen's troops surrounding Wallingford. Stephen responded by mustering a large force from Oxford, leading to a standoff across the River Thames at Wallingford in July of 1153. Both sides, weary of conflict and influenced by peacemaking efforts from the Church, agreed to a truce rather than engagement in battle. The peaceful resolution at Wallingford, well, it rather frustrated Stephen's son Eustace, who departed to raise funds for further conflict. But I hope he kept the receipts, because he died in the next month. No refunds. Eustace's death removed a significant obstacle to the peace process, facilitating negotiations between Stephen and Henry. Despite the ongoing skirmishes, such as Henry's capture of Oxford and Stamford, and a failed siege of Nottingham Castle by Angevin forces, momentum was building towards a resolution. Permanent peace was finally brokered in Winchester, where Stephen and Henry met to discuss terms. The resulting Treaty of Winchester, ratified in November of 1153, saw Stephen acknowledge Henry as his adopted son and successor. Stephen retained all royal powers, but agreed to listen to Henry's counsel. William, Stephen's remaining son, renounced his claim to the throne in exchange for assurances over his lands. Key castles were to be held by guarantors on behalf of Henry, while Stephen would have access to Henry's castles. Foreign mercenaries were to be demobilized and sent home, and the treaty was sealed with a public kiss of peace in Winchester Cathedral. Interesting, marking the formal end to the Civil War and establishing a framework for the peaceful succession of Henry Fitz-Empress. Now, Stephen, he remained active in early 1154, asserting royal authority by issuing writs for the southeast and holding court in York to reassure the northern barons of the crown's restored power. His meeting with the Count of Flanders in Dover later that year might have been part of efforts to secure his family's status before his death from a stomach disorder on October the 25th, 1154. Henry Fitz-Empress, not rushing his return to England, arrived in December of 1154 and was swiftly crowned alongside his wife Eleanor. The coronation was followed by a royal court in April of 1155, where barons reaffirmed their loyalty. Henry aimed to revive his grandfather, Henry I's governmental methods, distancing his reign from the disarray of Stephen's rule, emphasizing consultation and responsiveness, unlike his mother, the Empress Matilda. Thus England had suffered greatly during this conflict. The widespread lawlessness and devastation, with no real royal to lead them, especially in regions like the southwest, the Thames Valley and East Anglia. Well, they were the worst areas. The war had thus fragmented the central coinage system, with various factions minting their own currencies. The royal forest law had collapsed in many areas, although some regions remained largely unaffected by the war. Royal income from estates had also significantly declined, especially post-1141, and royal governance had increasingly centered around Westminster rather than Winchester. Henry II focused on restoring order and royal finances upon taking power, expelling foreign mercenaries and demolishing unauthorized castles, although recent studies do suggest that fewer castles were destroyed than previously thought. Thus he revitalized the financial administration, largely restoring the fiscal health of the kingdom by the 1160s. He also addressed territorial losses incurred during the war. In 1157, he pressured Malcolm IV of Scotland to return lands taken in northern England, which Henry promptly refortified. Restoring control over Wales was, admittedly, more challenging, requiring military campaigns in 1157 and 58, before Welsh princes Owain Gwynedd and Rhys ap Gruffydd agreed to terms to re-establish pre-war territorial divisions. And with that, we arrive at the end of our video on Anarchy in the not United Kingdom. I'd like to thank my top tier supporters: Eric, James, Tim, Wendy, Jeffrey, JC, Stark Factory, Charles, and Britt. And my friend, I would like to thank you very much for listening all this way. I know you're out there somewhere, fighting your own battles, as we all are. I'd like to wish you good luck in that. But perhaps now it's best to get a little bit of rest. I know I need it. Good night, everyone. From the bottom of my heart, thank you once again for joining me, and I will see you tomorrow.